Hey everyone, Tom here. Just before we get into this video of our 13F updates, I just want to say a quick thank you to everyone that's checked out the Investing with Tom podcast so far. Had a really good response after releasing that. We have 3 episodes already available, so if you're interested in checking out that podcast, again, the link will be down in the description below. But for now, let's get into the video and I hope you enjoy. Hey guys, Tom here from the Investing with Tom YouTube channel. Welcome back to the channel. If you enjoyed today's video, hit like, hit subscribe, and that way you can see future videos as well. So, as investors, every quarter we are privileged to get a key piece of information about some of our favorite investors' portfolios, and that is basically the 13F filings. Each quarter, big investors over in the US have to file something called a 13F. As long as they're managing over 100 million US dollars in their sort of professional fund, they have to file all of their sort of long investment positions. They tell us what stocks they own, which ones were bought and sold and how much, and that information is really useful in order for us as smaller individual investors to sort of generate a watch list of ideas to look into. If there's businesses in these 13Fs that have passed through the filters of Mohnish Pabrai and Warren Buffett and Spier and Bill Ackman and ended up in their portfolios, that's probably a really good hunting ground for us to start digging into some of these companies. So in this video, I'm going to go through some of the 13Fs that I go through every quarter for my favorite investors. And each quarter, I also like to present sort of a new investor that I've come across. So we'll get into that as well. But without further ado, let's jump straight into these new 13F filings. Now let's start straight out with the big dog, and that has been Berkshire Hathaway and Warren Buffett. Now, a few things to keep in mind here. So Berkshire Hathaway and Warren Buffett have investments in several companies, a huge number of companies at this point. This 13F is just going to show us their publicly held investments, only the long positions. I don't think they short anything anyway, but if they did, it wouldn't show up in here. And only their holdings in the US. So if they have any international investments, that's not going to show up in this filing. But nonetheless, if we look through the top positions for Berkshire Hathaway, Berkshire at the moment owns 53 stocks according to Whale Wisdom, but they are very concentrated in sort of their best ideas and their largest investments. So for example, Apple is currently 43.6% of the portfolio. That one stock alone makes up a huge percentage of Berkshire's holdings. Next we have Bank of America, then we have Coca-Cola, then we have American Express, Kraft Heinz, and Verizon, which we'll talk about in a sec. And after that, we're now down to sort of 2.5% positions kind of the way through, and they sort of get smaller and smaller and smaller. So up that top end of the portfolio, we have a massive percentage of Berkshire's investments. Now, we have a few key changes this quarter from Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway. Keep in mind, these 13Fs are at a 90-day delay. So this is as of the 31st of December 2020. These were Berkshire's holdings. So the first change is with their largest position, which is Apple, and that was decreased in size by about 6%, or about 57 million shares. Now, this continues the trend from last quarter. Buffett also kind of trimmed that position somewhat. And it's interesting to see, you know, the guy that is sort of known for never selling, starting to sell some of these Apple shares. If that doesn't tell you something about Apple's share price right now, I don't quite know what will. So that's Apple. The other big change, and really the biggest story of this 13F this quarter for Berkshire Hathaway, was the purchase of Verizon. So Berkshire Hathaway now has a position in Verizon with about $8.6 billion. And this was really kind of the headline story of this filing. So Verizon, obviously being a major telecommunications player over in the US, is now 3.19% of Berkshire Hathaway's investment portfolio. Next change we have is US Corp. That is a decrease in holding somewhat, so that's dropped from about 2.26% of the portfolio to 2.07. And the other big new position that we have is Chevron. Now that is brand new. It's about a $4 billion investment, and it makes up 1.5% of Berkshire's portfolio. Now, a few other big stories from the Berkshire Hathaway 13F. If we look at the positions that have been really sold down the most, at the top of the list is Wells Fargo, and this is a trend that again has continued over the past few quarters. Berkshire now only has 0.59% of their portfolio in Wells Fargo. Wells used to be one of the really, really large positions, certainly in that sort of top 5 kind of category, and that's now down to nothing, or near enough nothing. It's under 1% of the portfolio, so that selling sort of continues. And we had a few of the other US financials that were sold out of. So we have PNC Financial, JP Morgan, and US Bancorp were all reduced basically to zero in the case of those stocks. And all the other sales besides Apple, which we've already talked about, were kind of small adjustments around the edges. There were no huge positions that were really sold right down to nothing. Apple and Wells Fargo are definitely the main highlights on the sell side for Berkshire. Now, one of the things I'm going to be adding to these sort of guru portfolio updates is an extract from a site called TIKR Terminal, or TIKR, where kind of relevant. So like I mentioned earlier, the 13F filings are only US holdings. TIKR actually gives us all international holdings where there has been some sort of regulatory filing. So it still may not include a few holdings here and there if the investor is not big enough to own 5% of a company, or whatever the kind of regulatory rules are in different countries. It probably still won't show up in TIKR, but it will be useful to pick up some of the overseas investments for large investors with quite sort of high conviction bets in individual companies. So the first one we have, I'm just going to look at Berkshire Hathaway quickly. It was a big news story last year in 2020 that Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway took big positions in the big 4 Japanese trading companies. So we still see those in TIKR if we look up Berkshire Hathaway. But other than that, there's no major news stories out of TIKR or outside of the US for this particular quarter. And next, let's jump over to Charlie Munger, back here, Charlie Munger, and the Daily Journal Corporation. The Daily Journal Corporation, I look at every single quarter, and it very rarely has any activity, so this is going to be a pretty quick update here again. We've had no changes, no buys, no sells. The 4 positions in that portfolio are Bank of America, Wells Fargo, US Bancorp, and POSCO, and there's no change to any of those holdings. The Daily Journal Corporation does have some international holdings, but they're not large enough to warrant filing of any sort. So if we look in TIKR, we're not going to see any changes in there either. So again, as the theme kind of continues for the past few quarters and past even years at this point, probably 10 years at this point, no change in the Daily Journal Corporation portfolio. Next on the list, we have the shameless cloner, Mohnish Pabrai. Now, if we look at Pabrai's 13F, again, basically no changes. So in Pabrai's 13F, we only see 2 stocks. We see Micron, which has no change, makes up about 66% of his US holdings at this point. And we have Seritage Growth Properties, which is about 33% of his US holdings as well. Whale Wisdom's telling me there was a change of about 31 shares in SRG, which is a meaningless amount. He's got close to 5 million shares in Seritage, so basically no change. So those are the 2 US holdings that we have for Mohnish Pabrai. Now, if we jump across to TIKR, we actually do have one relatively new non-US holding that appears, and that is a business called Shinoken Group Co. Limited. Shinoken is a Japanese company. There are a few videos floating around on YouTube, which I'll try to link down in the description below, talking through this new investment from Mohnish Pabrai. And this one was triggered by a Japan 5% filing. So he owns about 6.2% of the company. If you've watched any of Mohnish Pabrai's kind of recent presentations on spawners and investing in sort of long-term compounders and being a business owner, this is one of the first companies that has appeared in any sort of filing for Mohnish Pabrai since giving some of those presentations. So certainly an interesting one to start digging into, but that is all the updates for Mohnish Pabrai for this quarter. Okay, so next on the list we have Guy Spier at Aquamarine Capital Management. Guy Spier, of course, being the author of The Education of a Value Investor and a close friend of Mohnish Pabrai, sort of famous for having lunch with Warren Buffett, those 2 guys, a few years ago. So if we look through Guy Spier's portfolio, Guy Spier is very good at buying high quality businesses and basically just holding them. That's kind of what he sees as really his main job as an investor is to identify high quality businesses, buy them when they get to reasonable prices, and basically almost never sell them. So if we look into Guy Spier's portfolio, we see very minimal changes. Now, in terms of the top positions, we still have Berkshire Hathaway. We'll actually see both the B and the A shares for Berkshire in this portfolio. But we have Berkshire Hathaway, American Express, MasterCard, Bank of America, Ferrari, and Micron all sort of make up the top positions. That top position in Berkshire is north of 20% of the portfolio. If you combine the A shares and the B shares, it's about 25% of the portfolio. But after we get past sort of Micron and Berkshire Hathaway, we're starting to get into 2, 3, 4% sort of investment positions for Guy Spier. So only 2 changes in the portfolio for Guy Spier this quarter. The first one was a purchase of Micron Technologies. He increased his ownership quite substantially in that. He actually boosted that position by 66%, or about 80,000 shares. One of the things I really like in Guy Spier's portfolio is a lot of these share counts have nice round numbers. I find that oddly satisfying for some reason. So a 66% increase in his Micron holding. The Micron share price has actually also gone up quite a bit over the past sort of 6 months or so. So that now makes up close to 9% of his portfolio, whereas previously it was less than 4%. And the other change we've got to the portfolio is actually Guy Spier selling out of a stock, and that is a business called Stellantis. Now, if you haven't heard of Stellantis before, or haven't heard of Guy Spier owning a business called Stellantis, that actually used to be Fiat Chrysler. So Fiat Chrysler recently went through a merger with the PSA Group, Peugeot, and so on, and they paid out some special dividends and so on as well. But interestingly, judging by the dates on this filing, I suspect Guy Spier may have actually sold out before that special dividend kind of turned up for Stellantis. So nonetheless, he's sold all the way out of it. He's held that Fiat Chrysler position since around 2012, I believe. So it's been almost 10 years, even 9-10 years that he's held that investment. He still owns sort of the Ferrari spin-off component of that, but he's now sold the Fiat Chrysler / Stellantis / PSA Group portion all the way down to 0. Okay, so 2 more 13Fs to look through. The first one we're going to have a look at is Lou at Himalaya Capital. Now, if you're not familiar with Lou, he's the only investment manager that Charlie Munger back here has ever invested his money with. And he runs a quite concentrated portfolio. He certainly has some investments in China. In more recent years, in the last probably 1 to 2 years, he started to invest more and more in the US. When I first started following his 13F filings, a couple of years ago, there was literally nothing showing up, and over the past few quarters, we've had more and more continue to pop up in his US holdings. So currently, Lou has 6 US investments. We have Micron, again, that's kind of a common theme across a few of these recent portfolios. Micron, Bank of America, Facebook, Google, Apple, and a new position which we'll talk about in a sec called Pinduoduo Inc. Not sure if I'm saying that right, but I'll put the spelling and everything up here. Pinduoduo Inc. So in terms of holdings, Micron is still the largest. It makes up close to 50% of his US holdings at this point, 47.5%. No change in Micron. We had no change in Bank of America. We did have Facebook being sold down slightly. So Facebook was reduced by about 27% in terms of the kind of sheer number of shares that Lou owns. And we also had Google in the portfolio with no change at all. So in terms of existing positions, the only change that was made was a reduction in the Facebook investment. But we have 2 new stocks turning up for Lou, and this is where things get really interesting. So the first one is very surprising to me, and that is actually Apple. So Lou now has about $100 million position in Apple. Makes up about 5.5% of his US holdings, and it's a brand new investment position for him this quarter. Now, the reason I say that surprises me a lot is because Apple is a business that's been on my watch list for quite some time. Warren Buffett purchased it back in 2016 when it was kind of an underappreciated business, I guess, at that time. We all know that Apple has done phenomenally well, but back in sort of 2015, 2016, they were really experiencing their first sort of quarter of negative growth for the iPhone business. And a lot of people really kind of threw the Apple stock down in the dumps. It got down to very low double-digit PE multiples, sort of 12, 14, something like that, and that is where Berkshire and Warren Buffett kind of built their position massively. Now, if we look at the Apple stock price, it's trading at a much more expensive multiple, closer to probably 40 times earnings. So for someone like Lou, who's a very prudent value investor, to get interested in Apple at those prices, I find kind of intriguing, and it's certainly going to be one that I will be keeping an eye on in the coming quarters for Lou. And the final change is another new purchase into Pinduoduo, as I mentioned earlier, and this now is a $64.5 million position for Lou, makes up about 3.5% of his portfolio. So that's a brand new stock for Lou. If we do a quick Google search, it tells me that this business is a sort of agricultural e-commerce platform in China. So that really interests me, being on the agricultural side. Agriculture in China is not something I know as much about, but certainly one that I will be digging into. It's just a quick look through some of the financial statements. We're seeing really, really fast growth for this business, but it's yet to reach profitability. So that's generally something that I don't like to invest in too much, but potentially it's one to keep an eye on, maybe hitting some sort of inflection point for profitability. I don't quite know, but it seems like an interesting one to have a look at. And that is Lou's portfolio with Pinduoduo, just if you're wondering. Even though that is a Chinese company, they are listed in the US. So that is why that appears on the 13F filing. And final thing for Lou is if we jump over to TIKR and look at any international holdings, the only one that shows up here that wasn't in a 13F is his holding in BYD. Now, BYD is a business over in China, again, manufacturing electric vehicles. And this is a company that Lou introduced both Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger to many years ago. And Berkshire actually made a small investment in BYD, as did the Daily Journal Corporation. So Lou has actually reduced his position very slightly. It's down about 2.3%. He still owns about 7% of the overall business of all the shares outstanding. So that is a very, very substantial position for Lou that's coming through at about $2.3 billion, which if we include that as well as all of the 13F holdings, that's about 55% of Lou's portfolio. So a massive percentage of the fund for Himalaya Capital is still sitting in BYD. Okay, and the final investor that I want to go through the 13F for is a new investor to the channel, and that is a guy by the name of Norbert Lou. Now, I mentioned Norbert Lou in a previous video not too long ago and said I was going to include him in the 13F update, so here it is. Again, he's a value investor. He kind of flies under the radar. He's not particularly well known, and he doesn't like to publish a whole lot of stuff to the public, so it's a little bit tricky to kind of find information on him, but he does run a very interesting portfolio. So if we look at his 13F, he only has 3 stocks. His partnership, his investment firm is called Punch Card Capital. Now, if you've watched any of my videos talking about Warren Buffett's punch card analogy, you will know exactly what that name references. And yeah, we only see 3 stocks in the 13F. If we jump over to TIKR, we actually will see a couple more, which I'll get to in a sec. But let's go through some of the holdings for Norbert Lou and Punch Card Management. Now, of course, judging by the sort of Warren Buffett-inspired name of this firm and just the concentrated sort of portfolio in general, it's probably unlikely we're going to see massive changes quarter to quarter. It sort of seems like Norbert Lou probably takes a big swing every now and again, but is certainly not one to trim around the edges or make small changes quarter to quarter. And that's basically exactly what we see in this recent 13F update. So the 3 holdings still remain Berkshire Hathaway A shares, Ally Financial, and Winnebago, which is a recreational vehicle sort of company. So Berkshire A, if we look at just the US holdings, makes up about 40% of the portfolio. Ally Financial is about 39%, so pretty much the same size as Berkshire. And Winnebago is about 20.4% of the US holdings for Punch Card Management. Now, heading across to TIKR to see sort of all of the positions for Punch Card Management, we again see those 3 US holdings showing up from 13F filings, but we actually have 2 additional holdings for Norbert Lou. Now, the first one is Naked Wines PLC. This is, I believe, a online wine retailer in the UK, I want to say. And this is a position that hasn't been modified super recently, but in a filing that came out mid-2020, this was reduced by about 13%, but it still makes up about 7% of the overall portfolio for Norbert Lou. It's about a $23 million position compared to, say, about $120 million for Berkshire Hathaway, just to sort of put that in context. So that's Naked Wines. The other position we see in here is a business called Motorpoint Group PLC. Now this, I believe, again, is a UK business, and I want to say this is one of the largest, if not the largest, sort of second-hand vehicle seller over in the UK. So really interesting to see that position in Norbert Lou's portfolio. It is a fairly small one. It's the smallest investment, worth about $9 million at the time of the last filing. Again, compare that to the Berkshire position or the Ally Financial position, both of which are around $120 million. It's quite a small investment for Norbert Lou, but nonetheless interesting to see those two international businesses in the portfolio. So there you have it. Those are all of the 13F updates for this quarter, tied in with a few international holdings where it is possible for us to get that information. So I really hope you enjoyed that video. For me, these 13Fs and the TIKR filings and everything really are probably one of my favorite hunting grounds for trying to find new investment ideas. So really exciting to see a few more things show up in those 13Fs that are of interest, and I can sort of do some digging into over the next few weeks and months. That is certainly going to keep me busy. But that's all from me today. I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit like and hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.